One writer has observed, the most amazing thing about the American people is that they are constantly defending their betrayers. Who then is the modern man? He is a mind-bombed patsy who gets his marching orders from twilight language key words sprinkled throughout his news and current events, so that even as he dances to the tune of the elite managers of human behavior, he scoffs with great derision at the idea of the existence and operation of a technology of mass mind control. Modern man is much too smart to believe anything as superstitious as that. Modern man is, in fact, the ideal hypnotic subject. Puffed up on the idea that he is the crown of creation, he vehemently denies the power of the hypnotist's hold over him, even as his head bobs up and down on a string. Mind control attempts to achieve within the percipient three destructive conditions: amnesia, or loss of memory, abulia, or loss of will, and apathy, or loss of interest in events vital to one's own health and survival. Amnesia, abulia, and apathy are universal in Western society and gaining a greater foothold with each day. I doubt any medieval peasant would have much difficulty in feeling a sense of foreboding and even terror in the face of the Soviet hammer and sickle symbol. Yet some modern literate people obviously don't know a thing about what that symbol represents, except on the most profane level as the implements of the farmer and the worker. In actuality, the sickle symbol represents Saturn and has for thousands of years, also known as Chrono-Saturn, or as the Greeks called him, Demiurgus, the operating engineer of the universe, as opposed to the creator of that universe. In the reign of Saturn, we see exorbitant building and modeling activities, and this is reflected in the Masonic reference to their god as the big builder or architect. Well, this sounds pretty good. We all like buildings and modeling activities, nice projects along those lines, but as usual, there is more to it than that. Because this Saturnian Masonic building is building against the grain, against the natural order. You need Saturn and his architecture after Eden, after Saturn had separated the unity of heaven and earth by means of that fateful sickle. So what do we have behind the cover story about a worker's paradise in the Soviet Union? We have the sickle, the very symbol of the bisection of heaven and earth, and the destruction of paradise by material and temporal decay. In other words, we have a grotesque mockery of the very principle touted. This macabre arrogance borders on the clownish for those initiates or self-initiates who have the understanding to see it. And I submit to you that it is this mockery which builds the psychological power of the cryptocracy. Let's explore this mocking deception further. There are essentially two forces seeking to tyrannize and control us. The first force represents the orthodoxy of altar and throne, reaction and conformity. As modern people, we've been raised to believe that it is from this direction, from the ancien regime of the old political spectrum, that we can expect to encounter the greatest threat to liberty. Actually, this is only a secondary threat. It is not the main threat for no other reason than the fact that we have our guard up against it. We expect that a threat will come from monarchies, presidents, Protestant orthodoxies, Catholic orthodoxies. But obviously the greatest potential threat can come from the unsuspected direction, from the force that is misidentified and masked, and that force which presents itself as fascism with a human face. If there is one thing we can say about the tyrants of church and throne, of tradition and property and reaction, it is that they rarely come to us in disguise. Their ceremonies are often vainglorious and pompous, but the core of their belief system, a credo they do not hide from their subjects, is the bad news about human nature. Louis Ferdinand Céline wrote, and I quote, "Since the end of religions, before this new modern altar, they have been swinging incense. They have been intoxicating modern man with a sense of his own importance, with all manner of rigmarole. Man has been made the whole church. No longer can he see anything with clear eyes. He is cracked. He believes anything that is told to him just as long as it is flattering to him. And Celine continues, the practical superiority of the great Christian religions was that they did not try to sugarcoat the pill. They did not try to throw dust in the eyes. They were not looking for voters. They never felt the need to wiggle their tails in an effort to please. They never felt the need of ingratiating themselves. They just seized man in his cradle and broke the bad news to him without reservation. They told him, you little shapeless stinker, you can never be anything but dirt. From dust thou art. By birth you are nothing but merde. Do you hear me, you? That's the evidence. That's the principle of everything. However, these church fathers went on, maybe in scrutinizing the matter more closely, you have got one little chance of winning a bit of pardon for being as you are, so filthy, so excremental, so unbelievable. And that is if you can hold your chin up in the face of all the sorrows, all the afflictions, all the ordeals, miseries, and tortures you will have to face in this life during your lifetime, whether it be long or short, but always with perfect humility. Life, you louse, is just one long bitter ordeal. Don't get out of breath. Don't expect noon to come at 2 o'clock. Just try to save your soul. That's something in itself. Maybe at the end of this Calvary of yours, if you get to be a regular fellow, a hero in keeping your trap shut, you may be saved by these principles. But even then, that's not a sure thing. Watch your step. Don't speculate on first and last things. For you, that is the maximum. And Celine concludes, that was seriously spoken by real church fathers who knew the tools of their trade and did not try to do tricks with mirrors. We can see from Celine's colorful prose that 20th century populism and 20th century conservatism are actually thoroughly modern and are really bridges toward the mocking deception, toward that tyranny that we have been taught to actually revere as the source of our liberation. Conservatism and populism are based on the same notion of statecraft as the second force I am about to outline, predicated upon the flattery of mass man and human nature in order to obtain votes. So at the opposite extreme from the church and the throne, we have the philosophy that describes itself as the rite of perfection. This is the alternate term for the Scottish rite of Freemasonry, the most powerful Masonic order in the world. This is the occult philosophy of not just the Novus Ordo Seclorum, the so-called New Order of the Ages, but also of the Elizabethan age and long before it. This is the intellectual conceit that the universe, natural creation, is going to be perfected by the godlike intervention of the human intellect. This is the philosophy behind the entire occult project which first came to the fore in Europe with the Renaissance. And it is true, as Francis Yates writes, that, quote, it was in its origins that the occult philosophy of the Renaissance had inspired some of the most exquisite productions of Renaissance culture. In other words, in the majestic incense of Renaissance art, there is also the whiff of the sulphurous. This malodorous current emerged with greater force in Rabelais' Abbey of Theleme, or Thelema, the philosopher's paradise, where there was but one rule, "Fais qui se voudra," or do what you want. Look at the mocking arrogance behind this claim of Rabelais. He, like his occult forebearers, is a Saturnian, a follower of the scythe wielder, who is, in allegory, the first to have chopped and disconnected the unity between heaven and earth. But now Rabelais comes forward as a spokesman for Renaissance enlightenment, offering us a utopia. If Chronos Saturn destroyed a divine Eden, Saturn being the force of time, decay, and the progress of matter, or the second law of thermodynamics, man will recreate a true Thelema, a better heaven than God, right here on earth. And that, in sum, is the cover story that maintains cachet for this other force, opposed to altar and throne, to this day. It is between two ideologies that we have been pulled in Western history, between the monumental autocracy of the church, the monarchy, reaction, and folk tradition at one end, and the alleged anarcho-libertarian, Gnostic, Masonic heresiarchs at the other, who only want freedom and love and toleration for all of us. Robert K.G. Temple is one of their better propagandists, and I quote, "The Platonic tradition in the broader sense, with its Gnostic and heretical overtones, and its myriad manifestations in later ages in such bizarre and fascinating figures as Giordano Bruno, Marsilio Ficino, and John Dee, not to mention the troubadours of Provence and the massacred tens of thousands of Albigensians in France, the Knights Templar, and an infinite range of hopeless causes over 2.5 millennia. Platonism in the general sense is a creed which denies creed, an anti-institutional tradition. It insists on nothing by way of doctrinal dogma. It is truly free. It has no pope, and it terrifies those weaker mentalities which crave a shuttered belief system. They always try to destroy it, but succeed only in destroying individuals and individual movements within the larger tradition." End quote from Robert K.G. Temple. Well, Temple has given us a classic statement of the standard propaganda front for this force. It's rather incredible to ponder the depth of deception residing inside those few paragraphs of his. We observe, first of all, a martyrology and a victimhood established. The persecuted freedom lovers, massacred, hounded, destroyed. Implicit in that ridiculously one-sided caricature is the notion of blamelessness, nonviolence, and toleration on the part of this exalted academy. Well, no one would guess from Temple's propaganda that his heroes, among whom he numbers the Knights Templar, were directly responsible for unleashing one of the most insidious plagues upon Western civilization, a plague countless reformers have given their lives to attempt to overthrow. Historian Desmond Seward, writing in The Monks of War, cites as the Knights Templars' most lasting achievement, quote, "their contribution to the overthrow of the Church's attitude toward usury. No medieval institution did more for the rise of capitalism." This was the Knights Templars who, far from being anti-institutional, were actually the prototype of the first international bankers. The first respectable Shylocks who made extracting a pound of flesh at interest the enlightened thing to do. Temple also cites as heroes the Albigensians, those paradigms of the liberated spirit in opposition to the Church. Well, it's quite true. According to the historical record, the Albigensians were horribly repressed with great cruelty. But that fact alone must not blind us to the fact of what the Albigensians represented. One of the classic examples of hierarchical viciousness and hypocrisy and priestcraft after the Catholic Church itself. The Albigensians swore hostility against the God of the Old Testament and the whole of the material world. At least that was their propaganda cover story. Hence, the rank-and-file Albigensian was sworn to live a life of celibacy and asceticism, the better to avoid entanglements in matter and flesh. But here's the catch. There was a second class within the Albigensian religion, a ruling class, or a priest class, known as the perfecti. Now, these perfecti, or perfect ones, were supposed to all the austerities of the rank-and-file Albigensians, and then take those austerities to an even more extreme degree in what was supposed to be a life led as a perpetual Lent. But as with most organizations, and as with imperfect, flawed human nature always, there was a secret side to the perfecti class, which they chose not to reveal to the imperfect class. Since this priest class was perfect, they were above the law, and therefore the perfecti in reality practiced all forms of bodily pleasure and debauch with abandon. The Gnostic, Masonic, free-thinking victims, as Temple styles them, and it's not just Temple who depicts them in this way, everyone from Gary Snyder to Robert Anton Wilson to Manly Palmer Hall, and most of the intellectual establishment of our day share in his assessment. These poor, persecuted victims assassinated anyone who got in their way. One of the most brilliant and tenacious of their opponents was the Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe, whose play Dr. Faustus was a stunningly devastating attack on the Rosicrucian cryptocracy. Marlowe was murdered by them, stabbed in the eye for his trouble. how different a picture history gives us of these alleged Neoplatonic rebels for tolerance and freedom and no pope and no dogma. In reality, the Thelemic current, the do-your-own-thing academy, is in fact a counter-church with rules far more rigid than even the church system that is their rival for power and pelf. For the counter-church has one thing the church no longer retained, the patina of persecution, the advertisement of free thought, no rules, freedom, kick out the jams, and beneath that, a profound secrecy about their genuine objectives. Churchianity's dogmatic propaganda has been that God is on its side. The propaganda of the Sanhedrin, of the Masonic libertarian cryptocracy, has been that it will make every man God. And in liberty, equality, and fraternity will their collective godhood reign. But as George Orwell stated in his anti-utopian masterpiece, Animal Farm, some are more equal than others in such utopias. Returning now to our original question of which is more dangerous a threat to individual autonomy and natural order, the threat from the tragicomic opera generals, kings, and churchmen who make no secret of their pretensions to glory and rule and the desire to dominate, or those other generals, kings, and tyrants who advance their rule under the mask of free thought, victimhood, equality, and heaven on earth. I submit that the greater threat emanates from the latter and has ever since the Renaissance. Under cover of all this finery, this exquisite liberal humanitarian enlightenment, has come a tyranny so immense it is difficult to grasp. A physical, technological tyranny as well as a tyranny of the mind. In the beginning, this horror was dressed up in the de la haute majesty of the Renaissance. Then the alchemical programming of humanity, and that, after all, is always what alchemy has really been about, the talk of baser metals and so forth being a code phrase for base humanity. The process, this intricate and delicate theater of the Thanatos, this hermetic shepherding of the sheeple, all for our own good, and parenthetically without our knowledge, took place inside the flowering of the greatest art epic in our civilization. I'm reminded of the French nobleman René d'Anjou, who was also a Gnostic magus, who in 1449 at the court of Tarascon staged a series of pas d'armes, curious hybrid amalgams of tournament and mask, in which knights went through the motions of tilting at each other and at the same time performed a mysterious species of play or drama, the plot and end of which was never entirely clear. These beautifully crafted and staged plays were actually a form of psychodrama. Those who watched or partook of the ceremony were subtly influenced by these dramatic rituals. Nowadays, the engineering of the mind and the transformation of humanity is not quite as edifying or nearly as artistic. The contemporary programming of humanity is now accomplished by means of cheap dialogue and scenery, as mundane and mediocre as magazine advertisements for whiskey, as Dr. Wilson Bryan Key has documented in his book Subliminal Seduction, whereby the horrid figures of the dance macabre are scattered microscopically in ice cubes inside whiskey ads. The conscious mind doesn't perceive these, but the subconscious does. Or we can cite the plethora of extremely violent and simultaneously symbolical popular films of the modern cinema, like The Wicker Man and Videodrome, which in a very coarse and crude manner, in comparison with the occult mystery plays of the Renaissance, continue this brainwashing and programming process. The issue of ceremonial and subliminal films, by the way, was raised at length in Philip K. Dick's masterful novel Valis, which I recommend to you. I should point out a fallacy at this juncture, which has currency among those heretics who dissent from both churchianity and all aristocracies, save the natural aristocracy, but who also grasp the more egregious tyranny and mind-napping that lurks behind the facade of the liberal, radical, revolutionary operation. This fallacy of even these independent investigators is that exposure per se of the methods and personnel involved in the cryptocracy's crimes is an ultimate goal. If only we could get some of these facts out into the open, runs the refrain. Well, I would reply to that notion that the cryptocracy is not stagnant. It is engaged in a remarkable process set into motion centuries ago, an operation which has accomplished most, if not all, of its chief goals with awe-inspiring dispatch already. In the beginning and middle stages of this operation, secrecy was a key to accomplishing these goals. Generally speaking, that secrecy is no longer necessary today. Quite the contrary. The cryptocracy has actually been determined to reveal many of its greatest secrets to we profane ones for some time now, but very few have noticed. Researchers were astonished at the wealth of material about the Gnostic Masonic occult cryptocracy, which appeared in the 1970s in two crucially important books. Kenneth Grant's The Magical Revival, three important books. Kenneth Grant's The Magical Revival, and also by the same author, the book Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God, as well as the aforementioned Robert K.G. Temple's book, The Sirius, and that's spelled S-I-R-I-U-S, The Sirius Mystery. These three works, revealing secrets of the highest magnitude, which had been vigorously protected and hidden upon pain of death for centuries, and in the case of Temple's book, millennia, were published with the knowledge and approval of the heirs to this knowledge. A book almost as important, the late Stephen Knight's Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, was published under similar circumstances, but without the complete approval, in my view, of the establishment, who had some minor objections to certain portions of it. Nevertheless, the English monarchy gave Mr. Knight special access to certain key papers which weren't supposed to be opened for several decades. And from these and his own brilliant investigative reporting, he marshaled very compelling evidence that the Ripper was none other than the royal physician to Her Majesty Queen Victoria, Sir William Gull, directly aided and abetted by two of England's highest police officials, Sir Charles Warren and Sir Robert Anderson. All three of these criminals were Freemasons of the highest rank. In fact, Warren was the founder of the research and intelligence arm of modern Masonry, the Ars Quattuor Coronatorum Lodge. You will also see a process of episodic revelations repeated time and again in these notorious Lone Nut assassination series. In Masonry, the Lone Nut is referred to in a triumvirate as the three unworthy craftsmen. The assassination of John F. Kennedy by Lone Nut, Lee Harvey Oswald. The assassination of Martin Luther King by Lone Nut, Earl Ray. And the assassination of Bobby Kennedy by Lone Nut, Sirhan Sirhan. In each case, at the time of the murders, both the media and the police conspired to present a united and seemingly infallible solution to these crimes, centering on allegedly ironclad and overwhelmingly irrefutable evidence that Oswald or Sirhan or Ray were the sole perpetrators of these electrifying crimes which galvanized the nation. Then, in accordance with the clockwork script, 5 or 10 or 15 years later, after the trail is hopelessly obscured and cold, a spate of tightly documented and well-researched books emerge which turn our heads 180 degrees in the opposite direction. Now we are shown a mass of evidence proving that the cops and the media had to either be idiots or conspirators to have ever believed that these spectacular hits were one-man operations. We have learned from these books that Oswald was a scapegoat, Ray a patsy, and Sirhan an OTO cultist. And we learn of their numerous, nay, legion accomplices. If you carefully study the scenario, what you'll find is astonishing. You'll find that the after-the-fact revelations are as much a part of the assassination plot as the initial cover-up. It's a deliberate psychological process. They are taking us through a psychodrama of enormous scale, but not really different from the principle behind that pas d'armes of René d'Anjou, behind the anonymous circulation of the Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, with those mocking hints of identity contained within them. We are seeing it again now in the case of Son of Sam and David Berkowitz in New York. And this, by the way, will be our lead story in the upcoming October issue of Focus newsletter for those of you who are subscribers. A decade ago, David Berkowitz was presented as the lone nut solely responsible for the Son of Sam reign of terror between 1976 and 1977. Now, in a book that is as important as the Grant, Temple, and Knight books, a new book from reporter Maury Terry called The Ultimate Evil completely exposes the collusion between the media and the police. Well, I shouldn't say completely, but he exposes some of the collusion between the media and the police in covering up the fact that Berkowitz was not alone. He was a member of a cult which provided some of the Son of Sam triggermen, a cult which used black arts as a front for its narcotics and snuff films and worse. But it's been 10 years. The trail is cold. Maury Terry, the author, sidesteps a few crucial things, distracts attention away from a few others. In none of these cases have any indictments been returned or any of the dozens of perpetrators involved in these spectacular murders convicted or punished. So what is at work here?